Hilchos Me'ila Perek Sheni, the laws of sacrilege, misappropriation of consecrated items, chapter 2. We're in a different room today. That's because today is the day before Rosh Hashanah, and the shul is being set up for the upcoming holiday. Nevertheless, no matter how busy it gets, every day we learn a chapter of Rambam, so the show goes on. The premise of Me'ila, what's the core of Me'ila? Me'ila basically states that if something has been handed over to the domain of Hashem, if it's exclusively for Him, it's a sacrifice that's going to go on the altar, something donated to the temple treasury fund. It cannot be used by a regular person for his personal benefit. And if you do, you commit me'ila, you commit sacrilege. You've misappropriated a holy thing. Today's chapter is all about defining the time frame during which that prohibition applies. As we're going to see, certain sacrifices, only at a certain point in their sacrificial procedure do they become holy enough that sacrilege applies to them. And also there may be a point where some of their holiness leaves. After a certain procedure, they go to a lower level where me'ila doesn't apply to all of them, only to parts of them, as we're going to see. And as I mentioned yesterday, and this is going to be for sure true today, don't get confused by the Hebrew terminology here. When you see the word moyalin bohen, me'ila applies to them. Me'ila applies to them means it's forbidden to derive benefit. The prohibition applies, so you cannot have benefit. If you see the words ein moyalin bohen, me'ila does not apply to them, that's a positive term. That means that there's no prohibition to have benefit from this holy object. So just don't get thrown off by that, because you're going to see it again and again in today's chapter and in the coming chapters as well. The positive Hebrew terminology means the prohibition is in force. Negative Hebrew terminology means there is no prohibition. And so with that, let us go to the Rambam itself. And we remember that there are two types of sacrifices. There's what's called Kodshei Kodshim, the holiest of holy sacrifices, and Kodshim Kalim, lower level sacrifices. Holiest of holy sacrifices are like the burnt offering, the oila, the chatos, the sin offering, the osham, the guilt offering, some of which goes totally on the mizbeach, some of which is split half between the mizbeach and half between the kohanim. Kodshim Kalim, lighter level sacrifices, are where the owners are also included. A thanksgiving offering, a peace offering, there's even more that goes to the owners, and not only the kohanim take part, everybody takes part, etc. It's lighter level, different rules apply to each one. Says the Rambam, there's also different rules when it comes to me'ila. Kodashim Kalim, he begins with the lower one. The lower level sacrifices, ein moyalin bohen ad sheyizarek hadam. So actually, even though there's a period of time where they're going to be consecrated, before they're sacrificed, when you dedicate an animal, you put it aside as a peace offering, let's say, now it becomes hekdesh, it becomes holy. Nevertheless, the prohibition of me'ila doesn't apply to them until they've been slaughtered and the blood has been sprinkled on the altar. That's when it becomes fully holy. That's when it fully enters Hashem's domain. Nizrak hadam, once the blood has been sprinkled, moyalin be'emurehen. The innards, the meats and the fats that are going to be offered on the mizbeach, the prohibition of me'ila applies to them. And even that is only ad sheyetzu lebeis hadeshen, till they go to be burnt and taken care of, in the ash pile. Once they reach the ash pile, they're no longer considered that holy, and me'ila no longer applies to them. But during that time frame, from zrikas hadam, from when the blood is sprinkled, till they're sent off to the ash place, that's when me'ila applies, shaharehim la'ishim, because they belong to the fires. They are Hashem's. And anything which is in Hashem's domain, me'ila applies to them. But not the other parts. As we explained yesterday, the part of the Kodshim Kalim that are going to be eaten, those can have, you could derive benefit from them. Me'ila doesn't apply to them. Afilu, says the Rambam, afilu helo ha'imudin shalahem lamizbeach kaidem zrika, even if you went out of order and you brought the innards, the meats and the fats on the mizbeach before the blood was sprinkled, ein moyalin bohen ad sheyizarek hadam. The me'ila prohibition does not go into effect until the blood is sprinkled. Similarly, if you remove the meat and the fat from the temple premises, you took them outside before sprinkling the blood, still ein mayalin bahen ad sheyizarek hadam. The me'ila doesn't apply to them till the blood is sprinkled. Nizrak hadam, once the blood is sprinkled. Afal pisha adayin hein bachutz v'lo yachziron, even though they're still outside, you haven't brought them in yet. Mayalin bahen, they rise to the higher level of holiness, and now me'ila applies to them. Shahazrika ma'elas layotze, because the sprinkling of the blood that takes place on the altar affects the meat that's been taken outside, bein lahakil, bein lahachmir, whether it leads to a leniency or it leads to a stringency. This case is a case of lahachmir, of a stringency. The fact that it's outside doesn't make a difference. The prohibition of me'ila still applies. As we'll see in a moment, when it comes to kodshei kodshim, the higher level of sacrifices, zrika can help meat that's outside in a lenient way. Because as we'll see, when it comes to kodshei kodshim, and we'll see this in a moment, so I'll just say it in short, when it comes to the highest level of sacrifices, the zrika actually brings down the level of me'ila. Before the Zrika, the Me'ilah applies to the entirety of the sacrifice. After the Zrika, after the sprinkling of the blood, Me'ilah only applies to parts of the sacrifices. This would be true even if the meat was outside, in which the Zrika would effectuate that leniency when it comes to Kache Kachim. So what I'm saying over here is Zrika affects a Yaitse, affects that which has left the temple premises, Bein Lahakil, Bein Lahachmer, whether in a lenient way or in a stringent way. Halacha Beis, let's get to the Kache Kachim itself. Kol Kache Kachim, all the highest level of sacrifices, Mayalin Bahen, the Me'ilah applies to them, the prohibition applies to them, Misha Hukdeshu, Adje Yizare Kadam. From the moment they become consecrated, the moment you declare the animal holy, until the blood is sprinkled. Nizra Kadam, once the blood's been sprinkled, Mayalin Bahen, now the Me'ilah only goes down. The prohibition of Me'ilah only applies b'davar shekule lo ishim, to the parts of the sacrifice that are going completely to the fire, ad sheyisaref v'yetzel lebeis hadeshen, and even that is only till it's burnt and it's taken out to the ash place. Once it's taken out to the ash place, there's no Me'ilah. And as we explained, the other part of the sacrifice, after it's been slaughtered and sprinkled, the part that's not going to be going to the Mizbeach, the part that's going to be going to the Kohanim, Me'ilah does not apply to them. Of course, they must eat it and have benefit from it. Halacha Gimel Ketzad, let's see some examples of Kache Kachim. Ha'oila, we're talking about a burnt offering first. Echad elas ha'oif, ve'echad elas behema, whether it's a bird or an animal, burnt offering, ve'hakoimetz v'halevayna, and the part of the flour that's taken from the mincha as the kmitza, the 3 fingers full, and the frankincense that's poured on the mincha, uminchas koyanim, or a flour offering offered by a kohen, which totally goes to the altar, v'hachavitin, and the pancakes brought by the kohen gadol every day, uminchas nesachim, and all flour that accompanies libations, mayalin bahen, these are all kache kachim, these are all highest level sacrifices, and they're the parts that only go onto the fire. They're not eaten at all by people, mayalin bahen. So therefore the laws of Me'ilah, the prohibition of Me'ilah applies to them, mishas hegdeshan. From the moment they're consecrated, ad sheyetzu achar sreifasnan al hamizbeach lebeis hadeshen, till they leave, after having been burnt on the altar, to the beis hadeshen, to the ash place outside of Jerusalem. Halacha daled v'chein, so too, parim hanisrafin u'seirim hanisrafim. Those bulls and those goats that are not offered on the mizbeach, they are burnt to begin with outside of the temple. An example of that would be the bull and the goat that the kohen gadol slaughters on Yom Kippur, which we just had the other day. And also sometimes when the court rules erroneously and has to bring certain sacrifices on behalf of all the tribes, those bulls and those goats would also be burnt. And therefore, these are a case that's going totally to the fire. Says the Rambam, Moyalin Bahen, Mishas Hegdeshan, the prohibition of Me'ilah applies to them from the moment they've been consecrated, Ad Yisarfu, till they're burnt, V'tigamer Sreifasan Bebeis Hadeshen V'yitach HaBasar, and the burning is complete out in the ash place where they're burnt, and all the meat melts, disintegrates. Before it disintegrates, the prohibition of Me'ilah could apply, even though they're sitting in the ash place and the burning place. Since they haven't been fully burnt, the prohibition of Me'ilah still applies to them. So to the red heifer, para aduma was slaughtered and offered outside of the temple in a way where you can see directly into the temple, as we're going to learn, God willing, when we get to that part in the 10th book of the Rambam, the laws of the para aduma. It was a sacrificial procedure. It was offered outside of the temple. It's considered on a certain level, highest level sacrifice, as we'll see in a moment. So the prohibition of Me'ilah applies from the moment it's consecrated till it's fully burnt and becomes ash. Asks the Rambam, Afal Pisha Hikikache Bedek Habayis. Even though it's like a lower level, those things that have been consecrated only to the temple treasury, which less prohibitions of Me'ilah apply to them. Nevertheless, it says about the para aduma, chatas it is a chatas. So it's considered in some way like a regular sin offering, which is kache kachim. And the Kesef Mishnah over here asks, so what if it's like kache bedek habayis? As we saw yesterday, kache bedek habayis still have the prohibition of Me'ilah. So the Kesef Mishnah wants to put the emphasis on the kaf, like. Afal pishahi ki kache bedek habayis, even though the para aduma is not regular kache mizbeach, sacrifices to the altar. It's not even regular kache bedek habayis. It's only like kache bedek habayis, and therefore you would think that Me'ilah doesn't apply to them. Therefore the pasuk says chatasi, it's a sin offering. Utanai bezdanu shalayim al adam be'efer hapara, says the Rambam, it's a rabbinic ordinance, stipulation of the court, that nobody should commit Me'ilah when having benefit from the ash of the para aduma. In other words, once it turns into ash, now the prohibition of Me'ilah no longer applies. The Rebbe once spoke about this on occasion. It seems like the Rambam indicates that it's rabbinic, even though in the Talmud there's room that it's biblical. And the Rebbe actually at the Farbrengen, he said, Tein l'chacham v'yech gamoid. I'm leaving the question unanswered, As the verse says, sometimes you hand off information to a wise person and they learn more on their own. They become smarter on their own. So this is an issue that the Rebbe left to us to resolve. Halacha vav chatas behema va'asham v'ziv cheshal metzibur. A sin offering of an animal, a guilt offering, and the communal peace offering. These were the two sheep that were offered on Shavuos. That was the only time there was a communal peace offering. Mayalim bekulam. These are all kache kache. So, same principle. Me'ila applies to all of them. Misha hukdeshu ad sheyizarek hadam. From the moment they become consecrated till the moment of sprinkling of the blood. Nizrak hadam, once the blood's been sprinkled. Mayalin be'emureya and ad sheyeh till the beis hadeshen. So the parts that are inside the meat and the fat that are going to go on the mizbeach, those me'ila applies to them till they've been fully burnt and are brought out to the ash place. Ve'ein mayalin babasar, but the meat that's going to be eaten, no me'ila applies to that. Also, if you have a bird sin offering, from the moment it's consecrated till you sprinkle the blood, the prohibition of me'ila applies to them. Huzadama, once the blood has been sprinkled, ein ba me'ila, the prohibition of me'ila no longer applies to them. Aval asur lehanes b'mur'asa v'neitzasa. But it's mura. Mura is a thin membrane between the hide and the inside of the bird, and that is not really eaten so much. And the feathers that are also offered on the mizbeach, those it's prohibited to have benefit from them, but it's not prohibited all the way. This is the first time we're seeing this concept. We're going to see it again a few times. What's called loy nehenin v'loy mayalin, which means initially you shouldn't derive benefit from it, but if you do, you still don't commit the prohibition of me'ila. So here also, you shouldn't have benefit from the mur'a, the thin membrane and the feathers, but if you do have pleasure from them after the blood's been sprinkled, you don't commit the prohibition of me'ila. Halacha zayin hamenachais. All flour offerings, regular flour offerings, which have two parts. In the last halacha about flour offerings, we're talking about the ones that are completely going onto the mizbeach. Regular flour offering. What do you typically do with regular flour offering? The kohen takes a kmitza, puts the kmitza on the mizbeach. The rest of the flour is permitted for the kohenim to eat. Says the Rambam, when it comes to flour offerings, where is the time frame for me'ila? Mayalin bahen misha hukdeshu. From the moment they become consecrated, me'ila applies to them. Afal pisha adayin len yiskachu b'kli shardes, even though it hasn't yet been sanctified in a vessel. You just have the flour in your regular vessel you brought from home. It is still holy enough that me'ila applies to them. Ad sheyaktir hakometz, till the kohen offers the kmitza on the mizbeach. Karav hakometz, once the kometz has been offered, hutru ashirayim ba'achila, the remainder, the remnants, becomes permitted to be eaten, and there's no more me'ila. V'im nifsalu hashirayim, oy chasru va'achar kach hiktir hakometz. But if the remnants had become disqualified in some way, or lacking, some of it fell away, and only then you brought the kometz. Since, as we saw in the set of laws about disqualified sacrifices, in such a scenario, the offering of the kometz does not permit the remnants of the flour to be eaten. So now whatever flour does remain in its disqualified or lessened state, there's now a doubt if they leave me'ila. Remember, kometz, offering on the mizbeach, typically makes a check mark. Now there's no prohibition of me'ila. But since the flour in this case is not being permitted to be eaten, so maybe the offering of the kometz will not affect that leniency with the rest of the flour, and therefore it's a doubt, stay away from it. Halacha ches, lechem hapanim, the showbread. The showbread that was switched out every week on Shabbos, and as we learned in the past, there was 2 bazichin, there were 2 spoons of frankincense that were offered on the mizbeach, and that's what allowed the breads to be eaten. So, same principles apply. The prohibition of me'ila begins the moment the flour has been consecrated, even if it hasn't been baked yet. Until you offer the 2 spoons of frankincense. Once you offer the frankincense, it's become permitted to be eaten, and therefore me'ila no longer applies. Also the 2 breads of Shavuos. Me'ila applies the moment they become consecrated, even before they're baked. Until you sprinkle the blood of the sheep that are brought with them, the 2 communal peace offerings that we spoke about before. Once you sprinkle their blood, the 2 breads have become permitted to be eaten, and me'ila no longer applies. Halacha tes hanisachim, all libations, flour, wine, oil that accompanies the sacrifice. Or more specifically, we're talking about wine over here. So this is the wine poured on the mizbeach. According to the Rambam, as we saw, this is only true on Shavuos. The rest of the year, the wine was poured on the bottom of the mizbeach. Point is, when it comes to wine, the moment they become consecrated, me'ila applies to them. Yardu lashisin, once they go down the pipes of the mizbeach, no longer does me'ila apply to them. Mayim shemenaschim b'chag HaSukkah is the water which you pour on the Mizbeach on Sukkot, kol zman shein bakad shel zav, so long as they're in the original golden jug, which they were filled up from the Shiloach spring, einen in bahen v'hanen eloi mo'al. It's the two sides. Originally or ideally, don't have benefit from them, but if you do, you don't commit me'ilah. Nasnu esan batzleichis, once they put it in the jar, from which it's going to actually be poured onto the Mizbeach, mayalin bekulan, all the water, prohibition of me'ilah devolves upon them, sha'arehein miklal hanesachim, because now they're part of the nesachim, literally things that are poured on the Mizbeach. Halacha yud leig shemen shel mitzayra, the small amount of oil used by a mitzayra, somebody who has the tzaras lesions, part of the purification process is they offer a sacrifice, and then you take the blood of the sacrifice and a little bit of oil and you apply it to his right thumb and his right big toe. The oil, that small oil involved in this procedure, mayalin by mishahuktash bekli, Me'ilah applies to it the moment it becomes consecrated in a sanctified utensil. Ad sheyizarek dam ha'asham, till the blood of the guilt offering, which is brought by the mitzayra, is sprinkled. Nizrak dam ha'asham, once that blood is sprinkled, le'nenin v'le mayalin. Now it's in the middle ground. You shouldn't have benefit from the oil, but you don't commit me'ilah ad sheyitnu mimenu matnaisav, till you actually apply it to the right thumb and big toe, as is prescribed in the Torah. Nasnu mimenu hamatonis. Once you apply the oil in the proper place, hutru ashirayim ba'achila kipsarchatas v'asham, whatever oil remains becomes permitted to be eaten like a meat of a sin offering or a guilt offering, and therefore me'ilah no longer applies to it at all. Halacha Yud Aleph called Dmei Shchitas HaKadoshim. All blood that were involved in slaughtered sacrifices, there was tons of blood around in the temple. Ein mayalin boy, me'ilah doesn't apply to it. Bein lifnei kapara, bein la'achar kapara, whether the atonement was achieved or not through the sprinkling of the blood itself, there is no me'ilah on it. Ad sheyetze lenachal Kidron, till it goes out to the small river of Kidron, which surrounded the Temple Mount. Yotza lenachal Kidron, once the blood goes into that stream, mayalin ba, you actually would commit me'ilah if you take it and use it for personal benefit. Because the Hektish fund used to sell that blood, use it as fertilizer for gardens around, and make money off of it. So if you use it for your own stuff, now you're misappropriating Hektish's belongings. Aval hamak is dam leben mas kadashim, but if somebody were to be a bloodletter, they used to let blood for clots or whatever it is from animals. That was meant to be a sacrifice. Harihu asur bahano mayalin by that blood, since it didn't come from shchita, didn't come from slaughtering, it came from bloodletting, it's actually forbidden to have benefit from it. Me'ilah applies to it. Hayil ve'ena yechela lichias b'lei dam hareu kegufa. Since the animal can't live without the blood is like its body. You can't have benefit from the animal's body, neither can you have benefit from the animal's blood. Halacha Yud Beis, ha'atzamais v'hagidim v'hakarnayim v'hatlafayim. Let's talk about things that are not part of the meat of the animal. Bones, sinews, horns, and hoofs. They're obviously attached to the animal when it's slaughtered, but then they start getting detached. Let's say they separated from the body of katshe kachim before the sprinkling of the blood. So after you slaughtered it, somebody came over right away with a big knife, started chopping off the hoofs, before you had a chance to sprinkle the blood. Mayalin bahen, me'ilah still applies to them. If they separated after the sprinkling of the blood, at which point me'ilah level goes down for katshe kachim. Ein mayalin bahen, so these four things that are not really part of the meat, me'ilah does not apply to them. Atzmais ha'oila, shepershu lifnei zrika, bones of a burnt offering, which is all going to go onto the mizbeach, and it detached before the sprinkling of the blood. Ein mayalin bahen la'achar zrika, once the blood is sprinkled, no me'ilah applies to them. Shehaz zrika materas eisam, because the zrika will permit them. The impershu achar zrika, if they detached after the sprinkling of the blood, mayalin bahen la'olam, me'ilah applies to them forever. The sprinkling of the blood doesn't take them out of that status of being part of an oila, part of a burnt offering, which is meant to be totally on the mizbeach, including the hoofs, including the horns. Atzmai sa'ila, what if you put the oila on the mizbeach properly? It's all being burnt on the altar. And then some of the bones, shepaku me'ala mizbeach, they flew off the altar. The fire cackled, something happened, they end up off the altar. Koidim chatzais halayla, before midnight of the night after the day it was offered. Mayalin bahen, me'ilah still applies to them. La'achar chatzais, once midnight hits, ein mayalin bahen, me'ilah no longer applies to them. Afal pisha paku koidim chatzais, even if they flew off before midnight. Kevan shehigia chatzais halayla, once midnight arrives, nasu kala ivarim commission isaklu v'nasu efer, all limbs are treated as if they're fully eaten up by the fire and have become ash. And once they become ash, me'ilah no longer applies to them. Yud Gimel gacheles shapaka me'ala mizbeach, if a coal, a fuel, piece of wood, flies off the mizbeach, bein lifnei chatzais, bein la'achar chatzais, whether before or after midnight, le'nenin v'lei mayalin, they're in the middle ground. You shouldn't have benefit from them, but if you do, you don't commit me'ilah. Avol gacheles shal kotche bede kabayis, but if it's a coal belonging to the temple treasury fund, not for the altar, mayalin ba, it's fully holy. Funny enough, it's even stricter than a sacrifice, and you do commit me'ilah if you misappropriate it. V'ashal heves, just a plain flame, le'nenin v'lei mayalin. Ideally, you shouldn't have benefit from it, but if you do, you don't commit me'ilah because the flame really doesn't have so much substance. Halacha Yudale Deshen HaMizbeach HaChitza, in the ash that gathers up on the outside altar, Bein Kedem Harama Sadeshen, Bein Achar Harama, whether before or after the daily removal of the ash from that pile, Me'alin by the prohibition of Milah applies to that ash. Tezvav Dishon HaMizbeach HaPnimi, the Dishon HaMenorah, the ash that can be found in the inner altar from the incense, and the ash in the lamps of the menorah from the daily burning of the lights, it's not so strict. Ideally, you shouldn't have benefit. If you do, you don't commit me'ilah. Halacha tazayin kol be'emas kodshe kodeshim shehibalas mum. Anytime you have an animal, kodshe kodshim, designated for the highest level sacrifice, and it has a blemish, so it's not going to be going on the mizbeach. Bein shekadam mum kavua lehekdesha, bein shekadam hekdesha lemum kavua. Whether it got this permanent blemish before the consecration, or it was consecrated and then it got the blemish. Va'afilu haisa mechusar zman, even if it was inherently lacking in time, it was too young, or its mom was slaughtered that day, which means today you can no longer bring it on the mizbeach anyways. Mayalin bahem mishahuktashu ad she'ipadu. Me'ilah applies to them from the moment they're consecrated until they're redeemed. But if it's not animals, if it's birds, the birds that are too young or too old, two types of birds can be brought on the mizbeach, pigeons and turtle doves, but if only once they hit a certain age. If the pigeon didn't reach its time yet, or if the turtle doves past their time, and they were meant to be offered on the altar, even though ideally you shouldn't have benefit from them, if you do, you don't commit me'ilah. It's a little bit less strict than animals. Why? And as we learned, a bird that becomes disqualified cannot be redeemed. It has to just be buried and that's it. An animal could be redeemed. Since the birds cannot be redeemed, they are treated like those sin offerings that are consigned to die. Therefore, they become less holy, and me'ilah doesn't apply to them.